Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. We'll get started. My name is Michael Strain. I'm a resident scholar here. We're thrilled that so many of you could come. We're also very happy to welcome the folks who are joining us via the live stream. This microphone used to be more adjustable. The subject of tonight's event is the relationship between economic liberty and human flourishing. This is a big topic. We obviously can't cover all of it tonight. So we'll be considering it from the point of view of different great thinkers in political philosophy. Tonight we'll be viewing it through the lens of Rousseau, Locke and Hobbes, and John Stuart Mill. This complements a panel we had a few months ago where we also looked at this question, but from the perspective of Aristotle, the Scottish Enlightenment, and Alexis de Tocqueville. And you can find that video on our website. And you can also find this video on our website. It should be up within 24 hours, and you can email it around to your friends and people who you think would be interested in watching. I'll kick things off with some very brief remarks. The great economist and thinker Milton Friedman wrote, "It is widely believed that politics and economics are separate and largely unconnected, that individual freedom is a political problem and material welfare an economic problem, and that any kind of political arrangement can be combined with any kind of economic arrangement." I would suggest that these words, written a half century ago, still hold true today. Some elite opinion looks to a nation such as China and sees a reasonable degree of economic freedom, but not much political freedom, and views that arrangement as sustainable and perhaps even as desirable. On the flip side, others believe in democratic socialism, where citizens have quite a bit of say in the political process, but where a large government imposes a significant regulatory burden on businesses and engages in significant wealth and income redistribution. Some would suggest that many advanced Western nations today fit that description, and many would suggest that this is the direction that Western nations are moving. People seem to inherently believe that political freedom is necessary for human flourishing, but can you have political freedom without economic freedom? Are the people who Milton Friedman was criticizing, are they incorrect? And are these two things really linked? Many would say that they are linked. If the freedom to practice the occupation of your choice is an economic freedom, and the freedom from coercion or excessive burden by the government is a political freedom, at some point the distinction between the two breaks down. In the United States today, on average, to become a cosmetologist requires 372 days of licensing. So the question whether that is an infringement on economic freedom or political freedom, in some sense, seems to be beside the point. Fundamentally, what we're talking about here is the ability of a citizen to enter the marketplace and to trade goods and services. Provided that no one is being coerced, all voluntary transactions presumably make both parties better off. And that's really a key point and one of the key philosophical justifications behind the market system and behind proponents of economic liberty. If no one's being coerced, then the only reason two people would enter into a voluntary transaction is that it makes both of them better off. Indeed, the great thing about the market is that it coordinates the activities of millions and millions of workers, millions and millions of firms, and millions of households, all without coercion. By the market mechanism coordinating all this activity, a robust private economy dramatically reduces the necessary scope of political activity. Without the market coordinating that, a government would probably have to, and so by allowing the market to do it, the scope of political activity is significantly reduced. To put it simply, economic freedom and the market mechanism reduce the number of things with which the government needs to concern itself. Economic liberty is therefore both a good in and of itself, at least for those of us who believe that the freedom to do what you want is generally a good thing, but it also is a means to advance personal liberty by providing a precondition for political liberty and a precondition for limited government. Thomas Hobbes, who we'll hear about more tonight, expressed the thought with a lot more pith than I just did. He wrote that liberties depend on the silence of the law. To the degree that human flourishing requires minimizing the external constraints imposed upon the citizen, the case for a strong relationship between economic liberty and human flourishing seems very compelling. There is, of course, another way to look at the relationship between economic liberty and human flourishing. A more positive view of economic freedom claims that it is properly understood as the freedom from economic need. As an example of this, consider Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, from which I will quote. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. This right is designed to ensure freedom, but freedom not in the sense of being free from external constraints. Instead, freedom from want, as Franklin Roosevelt described it. Viewed through this light, a large redistributist welfare state is necessary to ensure economic liberty, and the relationship between economic liberty and human flourishing is strongest when government ensures freedom from material want. So this is a very important question. It's a fundamental question when thinking about the organization of our government and the scope of public policy, and that's one of the reasons why the American Enterprise Institute has invested so much time into exploring this question. These remarks provide just a beginning. We're very fortunate to have three distinguished scholars here to elaborate with much more expertise than I have on these topics. Before I turn the event over to my colleague Stan Voiger, I'd remind you again that there'll be a video of this up on the website that you can share with people. And stay tuned, because we'll have several more of these events. This is the third, I think, or the fourth event we've had on economic liberty in the past year and a half or so, and we'll continue to have others, because, as I said, this is such an important topic. So stay tuned to AEI to see what's next. And with that,
thank you very much, Mike. I am not going to speak for a very long period of time here. My role is just to sit here and announce people before they speak. The first speaker that I will announce is Peter B. Josephson. He is an associate professor of politics and the Richard L. Breedy Chair in Ethics, Economics, and the Common Good at St. Anselm College. He will speak today about Hobbes and Locke and what their perspectives are on economic liberty and human flourishing. And I guess most of you have his bio, so I'll quickly summarize it. He's, beyond his current academic position, he's also the author of The Great Art of Government, Locke's Use of Consent, and co-author of The Irony of Barack Obama, Reinhold Niebuhr, and The Problem of Christian Statecraft. Professor Josephson, please do go ahead.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to be watching the clock because I want to make sure that my colleagues have plenty of time. But I will note.
Yeah, so that's one thing I was going to say. We're gonna the three of you will be speaking. After that, hopefully, we'll have some time left for a Q&A from the room. I will not very forcefully interrupt you, but by the time it's 11:30, I'll make you stop.
I will note, though, that I am the only person who has been asked to speak about two political philosophers. And I'll start by actually saying why it was such a good idea for our hosts to ask me to do that. We often think of Hobbes and Locke together and read them together. They're often paired. Both are 17th century English philosophers, separated by a little more than a generation. Both are state of nature theorists who articulate teachings of natural equality and natural liberty, and both describe the human invention of government. But the two are also very often contrasted with one another. And the thing that we take to be their differences, the simple differences that we see between them, may actually obscure something important in their teachings. And I'll give you just a couple of examples of what we take to be the contrasts or the differences. Both Hobbes and Locke give an account of a state of nature, a pre-political condition, which is either meant anthropologically or historically, or is meant hypothetically. You know, what would we be like if not for government? In Hobbes' account, that state of nature, that condition of perfect liberty and equality, is a state of war. In the state of nature, there is no mine and thine, no property, and no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no commodious building, no knowledge of the face of the earth. Hobbes famously declares that the state of nature is a state of war, and a war of all against all that produces a condition solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. On the other hand, Locke carefully distinguishes the state of nature from the state of war and describes the state of nature initially as a state of perfect freedom and equality, governed by a law of nature that teaches anyone who will but consult it that no one ought to harm another. In describing the plain difference between the state of nature and the state of war, Locke writes that they are as far distant as a state of peace, goodwill, and mutual assistance from a state of enmity, malice, and violence. So Hobbes and Locke seem quite different in their accounts of our natural condition, and this leads them to address very different problems. Hobbes is concerned about our natural inclination towards chaos and war, and he must explain how peace is produced. Locke, beginning more peaceably, must explain how that condition degenerates, but that will mean that for Locke we can conceive of a condition without politics that is at least livable. And already that suggests that the states they describe may come together, and I'll say more about that in just a few minutes. Hobbes and Locke differ also in their accounts of the politics that emerges out of this natural condition. To address the problem of the state of war, Hobbes counsels that every state must claim and be granted absolute sovereign power, and indeed that we are simply fooling ourselves if we believe politics works in any other way. Anything less than acknowledging the absolute authority of the sovereign, say, if we were to declare allegiance to the sovereign in some cases but to God in others, can only breed dissent and ultimately civil war. On the other hand, Locke famously argues that government must be founded on the consent of the governed, and that political power should be organized constitutionally into something like a system of checks and balances. Locke refers to the concept of sovereignty that Hobbes emphasizes only twice in his second treatise. First, as an example of a thing God has not granted to any person, and then, second, to explain that only God is sovereign. Where Hobbes emphasizes the authority of the sovereign, Locke emphasizes the preeminence of an elected legislative power. And yet, Hobbes' political account begins with a statement of natural liberty and natural equality, twin foundations of classical liberal politics. And Hobbes develops a prudential teaching of the importance of respecting the liberties of subjects. The Hobbesian subject retains something like a right to preserve himself, even if the threat to his preservation is the sovereign power itself. Hobbes understands that this right would be used to authorize the disorder that he seeks to remedy. And therefore he counsels that though the sovereign has absolute power, prudence teaches the rule of law, establishment of a judicial appeals process, the exercise of a power to pardon, and security for legal property rights, all of which will mitigate the danger of rebellion. Locke, writing in his essay concerning human understanding, gave two examples of moral propositions capable of scientific demonstration. The first is that where there is no property, there is no injustice. But the second is, no government allows absolute liberty, because the very idea of government is to govern by certain rules or laws which require conformity. Locke was a political realist. In his hands, the principle of consent becomes tacit and scarce avoidable, and expressed in practice by representatives of the majority rather than by independent individuals. And the prerogative Locke describes for the executive is about as much as a Hobbesian could hope for, and bounded more by prudential considerations than by concerns of right. The prerogative of the executive extends not only to pardons, but even to action contrary to law. In Locke's own example, it may be necessary to tear down an innocent man's house to stop the fire when the next to it is burning. In Locke's regime, too, we give up our natural right to preservation in order to be regulated by the laws of society. Locke understands, and he's quite clear about this, that his liberal politics works like any other regime to shape our habits of behavior and even our customs of thinking. So the two Hobbes and Locke, who seem so far apart, actually begin to converge. And it makes sense then, increasing sense, that we read them together. We're right to treat them together. Their similarities, that is, the similarity in the theoretical foundations of absolute and liberal governments, seem disturbingly greater than their differences. When sovereign power understands the lessons of prudence, it moderates itself. And classical liberalism really does involve a quiet exercise of actual political power. And yet, there is a further difference which ought to attract our attention, and that has to do with the status of property rights. Hobbes insists that property is not natural, that it is rather a creation of the sovereign. And so we would expect an extensive exercise of government authority over the private property it has created. Locke insists that property rights are natural, and so we would expect an account of how those rights work to limit the reach of government into private affairs. And again, the two now seem very different. Hobbes denies that property rights are natural. In the state of nature, there is no rule of mine and thine. The origin of property is entirely political. It accompanies the sovereign's establishment of the law and justice. The introduction of property, Hobbes writes, is an effect of the commonwealth. Thus, he says, we erect a common power to secure the fruits of our industry. So for Hobbes, government is necessary for the very creation of property and for its security. It is the sovereign who provides what Hobbes calls nourishment for the principles of property and the laws of mine and thine, and who establishes rules of contract and exchange. And Hobbes warns against public ownership of the means of production, in part because any monopolist will grow negligent, and in part because, and I just like this, commonwealths can endure no diet. Rather than involving the government directly in economics itself, Hobbes counsels in favor of taxation as a dependable source of revenue. Surprisingly, though Hobbes refuses to provide a natural justice foundation for respect for private property rights, his prudential political teaching aims to remedy the poor condition of our natural state by establishing a law of private property. In contrast, Locke insists that property rights are natural and that each individual naturally holds a property right that is not at all dependent on the consent of others. In other words, we need no one's permission to build our own property, not even the government's. In the beginning, Locke writes, the earth was held in common. But as human beings labored, they generated rights in property. The property became private because our labor mixes something of the laborer into the product. Locke argues that at first there were natural limits on the accumulation of property, beginning with a practical limit on just how much a person can labor, a limit of use or spoilage, but also including an ethical limit that enough and as good should be left for others. But these limits are lifted by the invention of money, and thus by the invention of commerce. The problem of spoilage is removed, and with money I can generate more labor through paying wages to others than I can actually perform myself. And Locke, it's a wonderful chapter, chapter 5 of the second treatise. It's wonderful in part, it's wonderful for many reasons, but it was the chapter Locke was proudest of. But it's wonderful in part just because of the math. Initially, it turns out that if you establish private property, then you can generate 10 times more wealth than holding things in common. But very quickly, it turns out that you actually generate 100 times more. And by the end of the chapter, you can generate 1,000 times more. It's just completely open-ended. So this invention builds prosperity, that is the invention of commerce, builds prosperity and improves the condition of even the lowliest day laborer. According to Locke, it seems that all of this can happen in a pre-political natural condition. I said earlier that Hobbes' account of the state of nature as a state of war and Locke's account of the state of nature as a state of peace and goodwill seem very, very different. But that means that that Locke is going to be at some pains to describe why on earth we would ever leave the natural condition. It is the defense of property, broadly understood, that moves the state of nature into a state of war. And in that state where there is no government to settle the matter, the state of war, once begun, continues, Locke writes. Though Locke's state of nature seemed characterized by law and goodwill, in truth, person and possessions are constantly exposed to the invasion of others. It is to avoid this state of war that we make government. Indeed, Locke tells us that government has no other end but the preservation of property. Now, Locke understands property very broadly to include not only what we usually think of, what he calls estate, but also life as property and liberty as property. So, government has no other end but the preservation of property, broadly understood. In Locke's account, we actually need government, after all, to secure the fruits of our labor. For Locke, our natural property rights establish a limit on the reach of political authority and broaden the claim of individuals to exercise their own private judgment. Let me just intrude one comment about this. In the essay concerning human understanding, Locke takes up the claim of what he calls the ancient philosophers, who were always trying to figure out what the summum bonum was. And Locke says it's vanity to try to figure out what the summum bonum is. A little bit later, he comes back to that problem, and he says, well, actually, you want to know what the summum bonum is? How many people do you have? Locke understands that individuals really are individuals, and that what is good for one, what constitutes flourishing for one, will not be the same as what constitutes flourishing for others. That's part of his liberal conception of politics. That is, in the liberal regime, individuals are able to pursue their own goods, and even their own highest goods, more freely than they could in a situation in which they are told what is good for them. While Locke is anxious, therefore, to defend the right of property, broadly understood, he's concerned also that private wealth may be used to generate political dominion. Dominion, that is, that a state might generate dominion over life and liberty. The invention of money introduces new challenges to a well-ordered society and new inequalities, and both thinkers notice this. For Hobbes, we need government to make property possible. Hobbes is concerned, however, that this new industrial life will create centers of power independent of the sovereign and able to act contrary to the public good. He warns that this is especially the case of monopolies, which he calls a private disease that threaten public goods. They aim, he says, at the particular gain of every adventurer, not at a common benefit of the whole body. And they encourage disputation with the sovereign authority. And Hobbes moderates the effect of the elevation of such private concerns with a policy of proportional taxation and public charity. For Locke, we need government to secure the property that is naturally ours. This, he tells us, is, in fact, the great art of government, to secure honest industry by established laws of liberty. Yet in his work on education, Locke tells us that there are two paired desires that we observe in children, and therefore we know that the same desires are in adults. One of these is the desire for liberty. The other, related desire, is for dominion. Locke says the desire for dominion is expressed in two ways. First, by having others submit to one's will, and second, through property and possession, pleasing themselves with the power which that seems to give. Locke calls these the two roots of almost all the injustice and contention that disturb human life. Locke adds that propriety of an estate is a fundamentally different undertaking than political rule. Locke is more Aristotelian than we usually give him credit for. Estates are for the benefit and sole advantage of the proprietor, so that he may even destroy the thing. Politics, on the other hand, is for preservation and the good of the governed. So, I'm on time, isn't that wonderful? So, in conclusion then, we're left with a more complicated lesson than we thought we would find at the beginning. Hobbes and Locke agree, for very, very different reasons, that private commerce is best left in private hands. Locke, in particular, emphasizes that this is important for human flourishing, and that it's important because of the diversity of human characters and human goods. But both also warn about the intersection of economic power and political power. A defense of private property proves both prudent and principled. But on the other hand, a realistic appraisal of the relation of private property to public goods must be made. Helpfully, the pursuit of private fortune can produce goods for the community, even if that's not the intention of the producer. Hobbes and Locke anticipate later thinkers in that respect. But they both counsel that we ought not to kid ourselves into believing in an easy harmony of public and private conceptions of the good. Rather, civil life will be characterized as a dynamic contest of assertions of the good. And just as much as the public power will contribute to the security of the private will contribute to the material good of the public. But essential to both is this idea that there needs to be a defense of the private good, that is an important part of recognizing the essential diversity of human beings. I can stop there.
Thank you very much. That's very impressive timing. Yeah, I mean, just under 20 minutes for two of them. That's very, very impressive. So we're gonna hold back on questions until after our other two guests have spoken. The second speaker today is Richard Boyd. He is an associate professor of government at Georgetown, where he teaches social and political theory. He's the author of Uncivil Society, The Perils of Pluralism and the Making of Modern Liberalism, as well as the editor of Tocqueville and the Frontiers of Democracy. His latest project, Subprime Virtues, The Moral Dimensions of American Housing and Mortgage Policy, explores the moral consequences of housing policy in the U.S. in the wake of the financial crisis, and I would imagine you can find it in bookstores everywhere, or at least on Amazon. Forthcoming. Ah, well, there we go. You know what to do later today. Richard, thank you very much for coming. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm live here. Thanks to Michael and to Stan and for AEI for hosting this event and for asking me to say something about John Stuart Mill. I want to start off with, I guess, some debates among political theorists about John Stuart Mill and about the character of John Stuart Mill's political philosophy, and then use those debates and what I see as some real tensions and some real ambivalence within Mill as a way of raising questions about his commitment to economic liberty. So I guess the title of my talk is John Stuart Mill and Economic Liberty and Human Flourishing. One of the questions I want to raise throughout the course of this talk is whether and how John Stuart Mill is committed to the idea of economic liberty, which may seem counterintuitive based on his work on liberty and also maybe his work on principles of political economy. And then some broader questions about what Mill sees as the relationship between economics, business, trade, commerce, and human flourishing, because I think there are some very, very real tensions there for Mill. So starting off with some debates within Mill scholarship, I guess Mill is understood by almost everyone, and I think correctly, as being a kind of liberal. He's someone who associated himself with the Liberal Party, really at the origins of the ideological movement in the 19th century that first called itself liberalism. So it's self-evident, I think, that Mill is some sort of liberal, but a lot of the debate within political philosophy is about what kind of liberal John Stuart Mill is, and I think there are just sort of lumping and splitting. There are broadly speaking, two different ways of making sense of Mill. There's the libertarian Mill, generally identified by people in philosophy or political philosophers. I think that the early interpretation of John Gray that characterized Mill as being a kind of libertarian. And it's not hard to see where this interpretation comes from. Mill and on liberty as a kind of key into this idea of a virtually unlimited liberty of speech, expression, thought, belief. But that's not the only interpretation of John Stuart Mill among political theorists and among philosophers. There's also another reading of Mill that emphasizes his commitment to the idea of social control. And this is an interpretation that I think has been put out most notably by Joseph Hamburger in his book on John Stuart Mill. And I think there's something in Mill to support both of these interpretations, that there's maybe something beneath the surface going on liberty and indeed throughout all of Mill's economic and political thought. And I think this complexity actually explains the real ambivalence, the real confusion that F.A. Hayek, someone who spent a good portion of his life working with Mill's writings, reacting to Mill, learning from Mill, commenting on Mill. I don't know that Hayek ever really made up his mind about Mill. There was always some way in which he embraced certain aspects of Mill's philosophy, certain aspects of Mill's economics, and yet I don't know that he ever really made up his mind, because I think within Mill there are these intimations of ideas of collectivism, intimations of idea of technocracy, intimations of what Hayek called constructivist rationalism that are woven into John Stuart Mill's writings. So I think there are these different aspects or different threads in Mill's writings, and I want to try to at least tease out maybe the less obvious part. So all that, I guess, applies to Mill's commitment to the idea of liberty, liberty understood in broad terms. There's also the question of his commitment to economic liberty in a more, as a kind of species of a broader commitment to liberty. And here, I think one has to turn not to on liberty, but to Mill's principles of political economy. The traditional view, and a view that you get reading through the principles, is that Mill is strongly supportive of the idea of private property and private ownership, someone who's committed to the general principle, as he describes it, of laissez-faire, who believes strongly that when public goods need to be provided, the first recourse should be to voluntary association, and someone who adamantly opposes government regulation of the market, at least as a general principle. At the same time, however, if you look at some of the comments that he adds, especially in later editions of the Principles of Political Economy, there is this willingness to entertain alternatives to the system that he calls that of free agency or of individual liberty. So there's a question of figuring out how these two sides of Mill fit together and of whether Mill didn't, in fact, change his mind throughout. So starting off then with the more conventional view, right, the parts of Mill that support his commitment to economic liberty. I'll just mention three aspects that I think jump out in the Principles of Political Economy. There's first the notion that many of the social pathologies that we observe that are sometimes attributed to failures of the market are not so much the failures of economic liberty or the failures of the market or market inefficiencies, but are actually evidence of the ways in which perfect markets and free markets have been disrupted or have been, been interrupted in some way, and therefore the commitment to somehow freeing markets, right, eliminating all these inefficiencies and all these kinds of artificial constraints. The Mill committed to the idea of reform and of liberalization. The second notion that comes through there is that when it comes to legislation or regulation, there are powerful reasons to assume that individuals and voluntary associations are going to do a better job, a more efficient job of providing public goods than governments will do. And then thirdly, there's a kind of worry that runs through not just the principles, but also Mill's on liberty, that in a society where the government or where the state assumes more and more social functions, that this is going to result in a kind of sapping of the energy and vitality and creativity and public spirit. And I think he shares this misgiving with Tocqueville in particular. So that being said, and without denying that any of those arguments are there and are conspicuous in the Principles of Political Economy, I think I want to try in my remaining time to identify four other arguments or four other tendencies that are there that seem to point toward a very different understanding of liberalism. Not the classical liberalism with which Mill is sometimes associated, but a kind of modern or collectivistic liberalism. That's not to say that Mill necessarily endorsed that, but I think his theory lays the theoretical foundations for what would become collectivist liberalism later in the 19th and 20th centuries. So first, and most importantly in Mill, and I take this passage and this argument in On Liberty to be the Rosetta Stone for understanding all of Mill's political philosophy, there's the move from the 17th and 18th century foundations of liberty in natural rights, the kind of the classical liberalism described so well by Peter that one finds in both Hobbes and in John Locke. The notion that human beings, qua human beings, are endowed with certain metaphysical natural rights, to the rejection of the idea of natural rights and the grounding of liberty in utility. And here I think John Stuart Mill really is the faithful legatee of Bentham. The analog in Mill's writings to Bentham's famous dismissal of natural rights as nonsense upon stilts comes already in chapter 1 of On Liberty. And I'll just, you'll forgive me for citing for reading a long citation here, but I think it's worth emphasizing and maybe unpacking a bit what Mill means by this. He says in Chapter 1 of On Liberty, "It's proper to state that I forego any advantage to my argument, which could be derived to my argument," I'm sorry, that's a typo, "which could be derived from the idea of abstract right as a thing independent of utility. I regard utility as the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions, but it must be utility in the largest sense, grounded on the permanent interest of man as a progressive being." So I'll say more about this new understanding of utility that appeals to the permanent interest of man as a progressive being. I think that becomes important for a different reason that I'll get to in a moment. But just focusing in on what he's done here. It's maybe not phrased, I think, as clearly and as explicitly as it could have been, but what I think he's saying here is that he's resisting the idea that the liberty that he's going to defend and extol in On Liberty is justified in abstract right. That is, the idea of natural rights and human beings being entitled to them at all places and all times. The implication seems to be that there are no such thing as natural rights, and that this liberty, which he describes in such apparently unlimited and positive terms in On Liberty, is really something that's given to human beings because of certain consequences, positive consequences that he thinks will follow from that. It's also, I think, important to point out that this understanding of liberty that he extols and he defends in On Liberty is a fairly qualified notion of liberty. Right? It's not a liberty to do anything. It's a liberty that's qualified by the harm principle. So I have the right only to do things that don't harm other people and things that pertain to myself. But it's, I think, qualified even further by being ceded only in categorical terms for liberties such as speech, belief, and expression, that is, forms of human conduct that cannot pertain to other people and must, except in very, very extreme circumstances, pertain only to the individual. So then what's the corollary? What's the importance? Why does it matter so much that he's essentially thrown away the natural rights foundation of liberalism and replaced it with utility? Well, I think it opens the door very conveniently to the idea that whenever liberty is not something that's conducive to progress, or whenever liberty is not something that leads to positive social outcomes, then it's a liberty that can essentially be taken away from people. And already in Chapter 1 of On Liberty, Mill has a number of different, exceptions, right? Children don't get liberty. And then colonized peoples don't deserve to have liberty. And then it's not a liberty to do everything. It's not even a liberty of conduct, but it's a liberty that pertains to these things that are somehow by their very essence personalistic or self-regarding, as he says them, as opposed to other regarding things. And he makes it very clear at the beginning, with respect to other forms of conduct that are other regarding as opposed to purely self-regarding, it's merely a matter of utility whether these freedoms are ceded to people or whether the state might in fact regulate them. So then I guess that's the big point. Then connecting that very significant exception to liberty that Mill outlines in On Liberty to his writings on political economy, he makes it clear already in On Liberty that trade, right, commerce, things that happen in the marketplace are not part of this broad category, this narrow category of liberty that he has defended and outlined in On Liberty. He says in Chapter 5, again, trade is a social act, right? That is, it's something that's other regarding rather than purely self-regarding. And he makes it clear that free trade rests on different grounds from, though equally solid with, the principle of individual liberty asserted in this essay. Restrictions on trade are indeed restraints, and all restraint qua restraint is an evil, but the restraints in question are wrong solely because they do not really produce the results which it is desired to produce by them. To sort of unpack that a bit, what he seems to be saying here is that in principle, there's no reason why the government, the state, can't regulate things in the economy, right? The things that happen as part of trade or part of the economy are not covered by the principle of liberty that he's laying out here. It's covered by a different principle. And that the only justification for the state refraining from regulation, refraining from interfering in the marketplace, is that when the state does so, it's not likely that its interventions are going to result in the outcomes that it intends. Right? It's a sort of version of Hayek's argument for unintended consequences. I think that's a fairly weak grounds, though, for for argument against state intervention, because it implies that in certain areas, if the state could in fact intervene and do a better job of things than voluntary associations or individuals, that there'd be no principled reason why it shouldn't in fact do so. And I think that's the loophole that Mill's philosophy either wittingly or unwittingly opens here. The second point that builds on that and gets back to this idea of what follows from eschewing the idea of natural rights, and especially a natural right to property, Mill has some fairly withering things to say about the right to property, especially to private property. In fact, for him, private property, as he describes it in the Principles, is a kind of fungible institution. He goes out of his way to argue against what people like Locke would say, that property is something that's natural, it's something all human beings are entitled to by mixing their labor with something. If I could just read a brief excerpt from Mill on the section on property in Book 2, Chapter 1 of the Principles, he goes on to say, the distribution of wealth is a matter of human institution only. So he's a positivist, like Hobbes. The things once there, mankind, individually or collectively, can do with them as they like. They can place them at the disposal of whomsoever they please and on whatever terms. Even what a person has produced by his individual toil, unaided by anyone, he cannot keep unless by the permission of society. Not only can society take it from him, but individuals could and would take it from him if society only remained passive. So then, speaking not just about private property in particular, but about the broader distribution of wealth in society. The distribution of wealth, therefore, depends on the laws and customs of society. The rules by which it is determined are what the opinions and feelings of the ruling portion of the community make them, and are very different in different ages and countries. And, he says, I guess both empirically, right, conjecturally, but also perhaps normatively, and might be still more different if mankind so chose. So this commitment that we have in liberal society to private property, to people being able to hold on to the benefits of things that they've earned by their own toil, is nothing more than just a convention for Mill. Now, he does provide, admittedly, right, in fairness to Mill, he does provide a number of arguments in the Principles for why society ought to be committed to protecting the institution of private property. But for him, that's a prudential argument rather than a categorical argument. And when he goes into, in later editions of the Principles, considering other alternative systems like socialism and communism, he suggests that there's really no kind of categorical way that society can arbit between different systems of ownership. And that really the only way of figuring out whether private property and capitalism is preferable to socialism or communism, it's really, he says, a mere question of comparative advantages. Which is something he says we can't answer right now, but futurity must determine. So we have to sit back and wait to see what new ways of redistributing property and reorganizing the distribution of wealth in society people are going to come up with. At the end of the day, for him, the question, which of the two will be the ultimate form of human society, that is, private property, free enterprise, individual liberty, or collectivism or socialism or communism, this remains an open question. And then lastly, I guess focusing in on the way in which private property is a kind of fungible institution, there's this rejection of the idea of inheritance. It's a way that he has to finesse this issue because he wants to suggest that if we're committed to the institution of private property, then it follows necessarily from that people should have the freedom to be able to give their property away to their own children, to dispose of it as they like during their own lifetime. But he wants to separate that out from a correlative entitlement on the part of children who did not labor to inherit property from their parents. So and he sees inherited wealth, the passing down of more wealth than would lead to a comfortable existence, especially the passing on of landed property, as being something that's deeply problematic for the kind of society that he endorses. Thirdly, yet another issue, and this comes back to the new version of utilitarianism, the way in which he tweaks Bentham's utilitarianism. There's a distinction that Mill makes between higher and lower utilities, the notion that there are some tastes or some preferences that are preferable to others. Now, the way that economists today most often approach the idea of utilities or of preferences or of tastes is de gustibus non est disputandum, right? That when it comes to taste, when it comes to what people value in the marketplace, it's not our task to say that some preferences are higher or lower. This is an idea that Mill, I think, strenuously disagrees with, or at least the Benthamic version of that. He famously chides Bentham for Bentham's comments that there's no way of saying that pushpin, right, the children's game is better than poetry. Right? Just when people, in fact, it might be the case that pushpin's more fun than poetry, in which case pushpin is higher than poetry. But there's really no way that anyone can step in and say that one preference, one utility is higher than another. Mill rejects this idea. Ordinarily, he says, especially when it comes to matters of consumption, matters of choosing a house or basic ideas of a consumer, he says that people's tastes and desires ought to be respected. But that's not, I think Mill believes, because people really do have a good sense of what's best for them. And there's this creeping notion, sneaking notion that comes in Mill that there might be certain educated, refined, or technocratic classes who, because they have a more developed or cultivated idea of utility and of taste, they might ultimately be the arbiters of taste. And he goes through and mentions a number of different categories of things whereby it's very clear for him that people are generally not in a position to make the best choice. They're not really in the best position to know what's best for themselves. He says there are things of the worth of which the demand of the market is by no means a test. Things whose utility does not in ministering to inclinations nor in serving the daily uses of life, and the one of which is least felt when the need is greatest. So with things like education, right, the things that you need most, you may as a consumer actually value them the least. So there's room potentially for state action to provide goods that people don't want, to steer people toward higher tastes and toward higher goods at the expense of the lower goods that they might desire if left to their own devices. There's also an issue for Mill that it's not clear that we really know what's best for us in the future. So there's a kind of temporal problem that so I'm pushing Mill a bit further than he himself goes, but it's not so far from this idea that you can't really trust people to make decisions about the future. You can't trust people to choose what's good for them, to ideas that we see today among economists and philosophers that want us to nudge people in the direction of making choices to save for their retirement, to eat healthy foods. You might think that you want that big gulp, or you want to eat that unhealthy fast food, that allegedly unhealthy fast food. But we somehow we somehow know better than you what's best for you to eat, consume, save for your own retirement. So again, I think Mill himself stopped short of that, but the underpinnings of his philosophy are precisely tailored to supporting those kinds of arguments. And then lastly, getting back to the issue not so much of his support or non-support for economic liberty, but his idea of the relationship between liberty and human flourishing, there is, running throughout Mill's writings, a certain kind of ambivalence, if not condescension, toward economic life, toward trade, toward commerce, toward commercial society. On the one hand, when Mill writes about the growth of civilization, he clearly sees material wealth and progress as being one of the benchmarks of civilization. In the essay on civilization, he points out that the building of roads, infrastructure, the expansion of wealth, material well-being, these are necessary conditions for the kind of progress that he thinks is most important for human development, is really the benchmark for civilization. But then above and beyond that kind of that necessary condition of material progress for Mill, there's the real sense of civilization, which has to do with a kind of moral and spiritual improvement. Now, he might see the former as being necessary to the latter. I think he also, like Tocqueville, interestingly, who influenced Mill so much, I think, in this regard, sees there as being a potential tension, that someone who devoted a life to trade, to commerce, to trying to gratify themselves in purely material terms would be someone who very likely failed to develop in terms of their moral or their spiritual character. Modern commercial society for him seems at moments to be flat, monotonous, oppressive, homogeneous. He talks about the importance of the spirit of innovation, intellectual creativity, people who are iconoclast, people who are disruptive in some way. He reserves the praise for these characters almost singularly to intellectuals, right? If he was a novelist, he gives all the great lines to the intellectuals, whereas the entrepreneurs, right, the other people who one might understand to be exercising some form of creativity and being iconoclastic and being creative and spontaneous, there's very little to be said in favor of them. Now, again, it's a complicated issue. He does have some of these same Tocquevillian worries about a society where the state becomes to sap society of its energy. He does attribute importance to voluntary associations, people coming together and voluntarily doing things to provide public goods. He argues against the tendency for administrative centralization. But I think what's missing in Mill is this idea of the heroic entrepreneur, right? Of that spirit of energy, that spirit of creativity, focusing in on and channeling itself in the direction of trade, of commerce, the market, as opposed to iconoclastic ideas or works of creative genius. So in conclusion then, the view that I've characterized of Mill, I think is not necessarily, does not necessarily exclude the idea of thinking about him as being a classical liberal, maybe even being a certain kind of libertarian. But what I've tried to suggest is that the foundations of his philosophy nonetheless open the door to these intimations of a very different kind of liberalism, a kind of collectivistic liberalism, if not a form of socialism. Even people who describe Mill ultimately as being libertarian have not, they've been attentive to these elements of Mill, but there's a question of how you put them together, whether there's a tension here, whether Mill contradicts himself, whether Mill changes his mind. I think that's the most common explanation, that early on Mill started off as a very committed libertarian, but then I think there's a Hayek's reading of him as well, that over time he fell into the influence of Harriet Taylor and got more soft on socialism and communism as he got older, that he changed his mind, or there was some kind of shift in his position over time. I think what I've tried to suggest is that while he may have changed his mind in terms of emphasis, that the philosophy that he lays out from the very beginning, the foundations of freedom in utility rather than in natural rights, lay the groundwork for, if not suggest a kind of necessary movement into philosophies that are more collectivistic, that are inimical to economic liberty, and that see economics and trade as not being a part of or a version of human flourishing, but seeing it as being somehow at odds with human flourishing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if Mill had lived for another 20 years, he would have become some sort of mix of Piketty and Bloomberg, and it would have been fascinating. I'm glad that in my ideal society, I get to decide what the high and the low utils are. So I'm less concerned. Thank you very much. So our third speaker, who will speak about Rousseau, another famous libertarian, is department chair and professor of political science at the University of California, Davis, Professor John Scott. His primary research is in the history of political philosophy with a specialization in early modern political thought. He is the author of, among others, The Philosopher's Quarrel, Rousseau, Hume, and the Limits of Human Understanding, and the editor of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Critical Assessment of Leading Political Philosophers, and many, many other books on Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who will be the person whose voice he'll be delivering to us today. John, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I want to thank AI for inviting me and bringing Rousseau into the belly of the beast, or perhaps kind of in the Leviathan's stomach or something like that. And I did want to say to Richard that I'm very glad that John Stuart Mill did not write a novel, and I think everyone here would agree with me on that subject. Okay. I've been asked to speak on Rousseau, and the subject is a difficult one for this conference, because although Rousseau has quite a bit to say about human flourishing, he has little to say about economic liberty or economics, period. Of course, his lack of attention to economics, or his subordination of his discussion of economics to political and other concerns, could turn out to be interesting and significant in and of itself. In addition, what Rousseau has to say about economic matters, including economic liberty, whether about the division of labor, commerce, economic policy, and other matters, often concerns what he sees as a threat that economic activities pose to human flourishing, as well as to individual and political liberty, virtue, and a legitimate and happy society. In short, at a time when other thinkers, and I think of Montesquieu, Hume, Smith, and many others, were arguing that there were benefits from commerce and from economic liberty, including, for example, the softening effects of commerce on morals, or the theory of du commerce, or its ability to improve the conditions of the poor, as in Smith, for example, or as its contribution to national power. I think of Hamilton, for example. All these arguments that were live in the time that Rousseau wrote. Rousseau, and I think characteristically for Rousseau, was wildly waving his arms, shouting, "Stop!" So, for example, on this light, there's a passage that opens the second part of his discourse on inequality that's worth pausing over. In the first part of the work, he has his own version of the state of nature, in which human beings are not solitary, nasty brutes in short, but solitary, stupid animals in effect. In the beginning of the second part, he's going to take humanity from the state of nature and bring them up to the present day. And here's how he begins the second part, his story of our human development. The first person who, having enclosed a plot of ground, thought of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. What crimes, wars, murders, what miseries and horrors would the human race have been spared by someone who, pulling up the stakes or filling in a ditch, had cried out to his fellow humans, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits are everyone's and the earth's no one's." Nonetheless, Rousseau continues in this passage to write, quote, "In all likelihood, things had already reached a point where they could no longer remain as they were." So, rather than advocate the abolition of private property or something like that, Rousseau accepts property, the division of labor, commerce, and economic liberty in his own ways. Okay? But in doing so, in accepting private property, accepting commerce, and so on, he insists on two things, at least two things. First, he insists on the dangers they pose to human flourishing. So despite accepting him, he sees them as a danger that needs to be confronted and regulated. Second, he recommends political controls on economic liberty to promote human flourishing as well as liberty as he understands it. Okay. So with this general idea in mind, let me begin with the threat that Rousseau believes what I'm going to somewhat anachronistically call commercial society, right, poses to human flourishing. So what are the threats it poses for him? Okay. But let me first begin with that question by asking, what is human flourishing for Rousseau? Okay. For the sake of time, let me assert that there are two dimensions of human flourishing for Rousseau. Measures here. First, unity of soul, a kind of cohesiveness of the human soul or psyche. Second, the size of that soul or its energy or its expansive quality. Okay, so unity and size. So what about unity? Rousseau is famously concerned throughout his writings about the psychic costs of having a divided soul and the danger that this leads to in terms of personal dependence and how that disrupts the unity of soul. Okay? These concerns show up in his account of human development in the discourse on inequality I just mentioned in several ways, including with regard to the division of labor and personal dependence and the psychic costs that each pose to us. The division, in his story of human development, there become several points at which he considers a burgeoning division of labor. For example, when males and females come together in the family, the men go out and hunt, the women gather. This is already a form of division of labor, and it only increases as the story goes forward. There's, in this sense and in the other ones, there's first of all a kind of dependence that grows up out of the division of labor. The most obvious one is that different laborers now have to depend upon one another rather than the kind of independence they may have enjoyed before. Okay? So second, Rousseau admits that this division of labor enables us to increase production. However, at the same time as it enables us to create production, it also creates new needs, which themselves start to pose a problem for us. And let me read a passage when he's first discussing this division of labor from the Discourse on Inequality. "And this division, was the first yoke they imposed on themselves without thinking about it, and the first source of the evils they prepared for their descendants. Since these new needs that came from the division of labor had degenerated into true needs, being deprived of them was much more cruel than their possession was sweet, and they were unhappy to lose them without being able to possess them." So as the division of labor increases production, but production increases new needs, now we need to chase after these new needs, and we are in a pursuit of them that is destructive to our psychic unity. But more costly for psychic unity is how this dependence on one another affects our very sense of self. Where we, for example, in Rousseau's terms, need to appear or believe we need to appear to be different than we actually are to our fellow human beings, where being and appearing are at odds with one another. So, for example, again in his account of human development in a discourse on inequality, he discusses a point at which human beings have developed almost to the point in terms of their mental and other faculties that they can ultimately reach. And at this point of having reached almost that point, he writes this: "For one's advantage, it was necessary to appear to be different from one in fact was. To be and to appear to be became two entirely different things, and from this distinction came ostentatious display, deceitful cunning, and all the vices that follow in their wake." End quote. More disastrously in this analysis, the given division of labor and invention of property leads to inequalities of power and especially inequalities of wealth that then exacerbate these problems of dependence of one upon another. So now humans have become dependent upon one another, and this very dependence, especially economic dependence, leads to a kind of corruption or disunity of our souls that we used to have. Okay? So, however, Rousseau does admit that our souls are, so to speak, larger than they were before. Natural man in the state of nature has a very small soul, if he can be said to have a soul at all, right? He only exists in the present with no idea of the future. He has no imagination. He has no connections with others. He doesn't experience love or any of the other passions that make us human. At the point Rousseau is describing now with personal dependence, the invention of property, we have become nearly at least fully human. We experience all those things. We have larger souls. But in Rousseau's analysis, the increase in the size, so to speak, of our souls comes at the expense of the unity of our souls. So we have the capacity for being happy in a meaningful sense. However, the conditions in which we live tend to undermine that happiness. So the unified soul of natural man in the state of nature, stupid and limited as he is, remains a kind of formal model for Rousseau, a kind of unity of soul he would like to recreate among developed human beings in various forms, including in the citizen of his legitimate state. So personal dependence is the threat to human flourishing for Rousseau, and his concern with the effect of dependence or interdependence, to put it into more commercial terms, is central to his thinking about commercial society and economic liberty. Let me now turn to size of soul briefly before returning to the question of how he sees these threats. Size of soul. As I mentioned, Rousseau does not romanticize natural man. Natural man is no noble savage, a term Rousseau himself never used. He's a limited animal, he's subhuman, subrational, and so on. If human development comes at a cost for the unity of soul, it makes possible types of souls, including virtuous and free individuals, who have bigger souls that were not possible initially in nature. So Rousseau's project, then, I would suggest, is a kind of soul craft, to craft souls that are both unified and more expansive, whether the citizen of his political thought or the more developed natural man, quote unquote, of his educational treatise, Emile, or other forms. However, this crafting of souls requires not just letting human beings develop as they choose, but carefully controlling the environment in which they live in order to make sure that human flourishing comes without the costs, or at least minimizes the cost of unity of soul. So I think we can already see the ways in which economic liberty and other liberties are going to be in some ways for Rousseau subordinated to his goal of creating a kind of human flourishing, to use the term we're using here. So let me turn to that now with this idea of Rousseau's understanding of human flourishing to what he believes the threat is posed by commercial society or economic interactions generally. Okay, his notion of these threats is evident in a passage almost at the very beginning of Emile, his educational treatise. Rousseau states there that there are two opposed models for human flourishing, although he doesn't use that term: man and citizen. Both of these, man and citizen, are characterized by kind of unity and expansiveness of soul in some sense. So these are two of his goals, or at least models, that he puts forward. But the human type created by commercial societies or modern societies more generally lacks these qualities. And Rousseau writes there of the beings who are neither man nor citizen, right, but modern men, let's call them. He says, quote, always in contradiction with himself, always floating between his inclinations and his duties, he will never be either a man or a citizen. He will be good neither for himself nor for others. He will be one of those men of our days, a Frenchman, an Englishman, a bourgeois. He will be nothing, end quote. And I believe that many people have argued, I think compellingly, that this is the first use of the term bourgeois that we recognize today, so that we get that from Rousseau. So Rousseau has nothing but contempt for the bourgeois as we would understand it. Part of the reason for the explanation for Rousseau's diagnosis here lies, ironically, in his deep agreement with the political and economic theorists of his time and before, including Hobbes and Locke, right? Who argued that relying on self-interest, and especially economic self-interest for our topic today, in the political, social, and economic realms would create human flourishing, with certain interventions and so on. But the idea is our self-interest properly regulated and understood by ourselves would lead to human flourishing. Rousseau agrees and follows Hobbes, Locke, Hume, Smith, and other thinkers in this tradition in seeing self-interest or self-love as central, absolutely central and ineradicable in human psychology. But he's much less sanguine than they are about relying on unrestrained or somewhat restrained self-interest. Self-interest and self-love for Rousseau are simply too strong and likely to degenerate into corrupt forms of pride, vanity, and petty self-interest that once again lead to a kind of disunity of soul on our part. His disagreement comes out clearly in his defense, one of his defenses of his the writing that made him famous, The Discourse on the Sciences and Arts, in which he argued, or seemed to argue, that the advancement of sciences and arts, and we can understand commercial society in this light, has corrupted morals. The defense I have in mind is his preface to Narcissus. Rousseau writes there, and I have a slightly lengthy quotation, but I think it'll help situate him, especially vis-a-vis Hobbes, Locke, as well as to Mill. He says this: our writers of his time all regard the masterpiece of politics of our century, the sciences, arts, luxury, commerce, laws, and the other ties by which, tightening among men the ties of society from personal interest, put them all in mutual dependence, gives them reciprocal needs, common interests, and oblige each of them to cooperate for the happiness of others in order to be able to attain his own. So the masterpiece of politics of our century is to increase mutual dependence on one another in a way that leads to the benefit of all. Rousseau responds to this masterpiece of our society, of our century. Thus, it's a marvelous thing to have made it impossible for men to live among themselves without being prejudiced against, supplanting, deceiving, betraying, mutually destroying others. In Europe, government laws, customs, self-interest all put individuals in the necessity of deceiving each other mutually and incessantly. Everything makes vice a duty. It's necessary to be wicked in order to be wise, for there's no greater folly than to create the happiness of cheaters at the expense of one's own. The free rider problem, right? Self-interest and self-love will lead people not to mutually cooperate with one another, but to mutually compete and undermine one another in Rousseau's analysis. So now, having discussed Rousseau's conception of human flourishing and the threats posed to that flourishing by socialization in general, modern society in particular, and commercial societies even more particularly, let me turn now to his thoughts about the economic realm and economic liberty. In order to do so, I want to focus on a lesser-known writing by Rousseau, namely his essay on political economy. This essay appeared as an article in an encyclopedia edited by Diderot and D'Alembert in the 5th volume published in 1755. This is a period in Rousseau's life when he was still friends with Diderot and the other members of the Philosophe, right? And in addition to this article in the encyclopedia on political economy, Rousseau, some of you may know, wrote all of the entries in the encyclopedia on music. He began his career as a music theorist and composer. Okay? Of course, when Rousseau published the first discourse, arguing that the sciences and arts were corrupting morals, people wondered about this paradox or contradiction or hypocrisy on Rousseau's part. So I object that you're not the only one speaking about two authors here. I'm speaking about at least two. Okay. Okay. So, at any rate, let's turn to Rousseau's essay on political economy to learn about his views on political economy and economics. Unfortunately, we're going to be sorely disappointed because Rousseau has very little to say about economy and economic liberty in his essay on political economy, which might be one of the reasons that Diderot commissioned another article on that subject matter. Okay? Okay. So Rousseau only turns to economic policies of the state at the end of his article. So how does he begin his article? He begins his article, after some preliminaries, by outlining some of the basic principles of a legitimate state. Right? And it's here that he first uses the term general will in his thought. Okay? He doesn't develop the ideas here in the essay on political economy that will come 7-8 years later in his social contract. But the sketch he has there of the general is consistent, I think, with the elaboration that he has later. Okay? Rousseau, in this essay, employs the term general will to identify the object of government. And that includes the object of government within the economic realm, regulation of property and so on. Okay? The object of all legitimate governments is the good of the people or the common good. Again, Rousseau doesn't develop how that relates to general will, but that's the object. Okay? This all seems rather unobjectionable. But the problem that lurks here is the fact that individuals, and especially the members of the government themselves, naturally, according to Rousseau, by their nature, seek their own good rather than the common good. Okay? As we've seen, according to Rousseau, this self-interested quest that's natural to us when we come into society leads to dependence and interdependence and therefore corruption of our souls, both at the level of the individual in the form of psychic disunity, and at the level of society in the form of abuses of power and so on and so forth. So the solution to this problem, according to Rousseau, is to make the law rule over the citizen rather than anyone's will. The citizens will be dependent upon the will and upon the law and the law of their own making, as he argues in social contract, rather than on a person or persons. So we will not have personal dependence, which is corrupting, but rather dependence on the law of our own making. Okay? The rule of law is the source of freedom within political societies for Rousseau. But once again, according to Rousseau, humans are naturally self-interested and also short-sighted in pursuing their self-interest. Right? He too believes in nudges, but in Rousseau's it's more like a big shove, not nudge, shove. Okay? They do not see that obeying the law is the source of their freedom, or they believe that they can enjoy the benefits of the political society without shouldering its benefits, the free rider problem. The citizens must therefore, according to Rousseau, be educated in a way to learn to love their fatherland and be virtuous citizens of the fatherland. They must somehow come to identify their own interest or their own self-love with the interests of the whole and the love of the whole. Okay? And so this is his solution, is a kind of political education that's much more reminiscent of something like Plato's Republic or the ancient republics of Sparta and Rome. So this is what he's discussed in his essay on political economy up to this point. Okay? He said nothing, or literally almost nothing, about economics. Okay? So what about economics? We turn at the end of the thing here, and there's something of a surprise. We've seen Rousseau extolling the education, political education of the ancients, so we expect a kind of constant, right? The liberty of the ancients is compared to the liberty of the moderns. But when Rousseau turns to the matter of economics, he writes this: "It is certain that the right of property is the most sacred of all the rights of citizens, and more important in certain respects than freedom itself. And this is for several reasons, including the fact that he says, quote, property is a true basis of civil society and a true guarantee of the citizens' engagements." Are we reading Locke or Smith? No. Rousseau is no laissez-faire theorist. Sorry, Stan. Even if Locke and Smith really aren't in a lot of ways either, but that's another matter, okay? So despite the sanctity of the right of property and the basis of civil society and property, which Rousseau has just surprisingly announced, right? For Rousseau, matters of economics must be subordinated to the overarching goals of politics, which are securing political or civic freedom of the citizens through their self-legislation, all in order to promote human flourishing in the form of unity and expansiveness of souls, I've mentioned. In this light, then, the same threats that he's identified that are posed to human flourishing by commercial society, division of labor, dependence, interdependence, and inequality in particular, must be regulated through the laws and through the administration of the government. Rousseau's hope, I think, is that the education and civic virtue he insists upon will turn the citizens' minds and hearts to the common good rather than their own self-interest, including in economic realms. But he realizes, he's not a fool, man must eat. That is, the citizens must be concerned with their subsistence and well-being. Okay? But rather than arguing like Locke and Smith that we should justify the economic liberty by arguing that pursuit of wealth and the creation of new needs will increase the prosperity of all, Rousseau has different ideas about what we should do to increase this. Okay? First, new needs should be prevented, right? So rather than increasing needs, we want to prevent or limit needs. Inequality should be carefully regulated. Okay? As for needs, he writes, if one examines how the needs of a state grow, this will often be found to happen in about the same way it does for private individuals. This will be reminiscent of our current day. Less by true necessity than by the expansion of frivolous desires, and often expenses are increased in the state solely to provide a pretext for increasing revenue. Okay? Again, Rousseau is no fool. Rousseau likewise wants to regulate inequality through proportional taxation and other kinds of measures. So for Rousseau, he believes in the sanctity of property. He wants individuals to engage and freely engage in the economic realm, but within an environment that constrains that engagement in a way that prevents or at least ameliorates the threats to human flourishing he has identified. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have many questions, but I'm not gonna ask any of them. We have about say 11 to 15 minutes left. I think that we should just turn to the room, and unless one of you wants to viciously criticize one of your.
We do want to, but
yeah, something very few people know about Rousseau is that he spent about 2 years editing and writing Wikipedia articles. I mean, they kept getting flagged for being long, irrelevant, and containing a strong point of view, and then he stopped doing that. So let's turn to the room. Right in the middle.
Thank you for a very enjoyable panel. I'm Alan Levine at American University, and I have a question for John Scott and for Richard Boyd. The one for John is short, so I'll ask that first. So the thing about Rousseau and property that I would have gone to first would have been in the social contract, where Rousseau talks about making property legitimate by alienating property to the state, and then the state gives it back. So that's the most chilling thing about property, but you didn't mention that, so why? And then for Richard, I thought you made, I largely agreed with your presentation of Mill, but there were a couple of points in which I thought you were a little too chintzy in your reading of Mill on liberty. And Mill isn't one of my favorite authors, but since all of where it seemed a little askew to me was the same direction, I want to call a few of these and see what you think. And it just started off with, right at the beginning in chapter 1 of On Liberty, where you said, Mill says, colonized people have no right to freedom. That's not exactly what he says, right? It's that backward peoples who are irrational and can't rule themselves have no right, or that the colonists can rule them as long as they're, colonizers can rule them as long as they have those conditions, but only for their own individual benefit. So it wasn't exactly, but then in chapter 5, you correctly pointed out that Mill distinguishes between self-regarding acts and other regarding acts, and capitalism certainly falls into other regarding acts. But also in that context, he goes out of his way to point out that in economic transactions and in a free marketplace, there are always losers, and losing in a free competition is not a harm on the basis of which the state can step in. So he at least takes that strong stand that I think that's worth bringing out. And then the last thing is you mentioned in Mill that there's no heroic entrepreneur. And I'm not sure if that's quite right. And I'm thinking of chapter 3 of On Liberty, where Mill goes through great lengths of praising the eccentrics, the tinkerers, the geniuses, who alone, he says, are the salt of the earth, who bring all the great innovations to mankind. And it seems to me that if you are a little bit more generous with that passage, that could really be a kind of heroic entrepreneur type. Thank you.
Thank you. John, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Well, oversight. But I mean, I don't think that Rousseau is in that respect that much different than, say, Hobbes, which may not help his case. But that he, as he says there, that what you do is you transform possession into property, right? So all they had before was possession. Although Rousseau does have a kind of Lockean mixture labor theory of labor value. And that, granted, that means that the state can now regulate property, right? But I don't think that there's any theorist who thinks the state can't regulate property. The question becomes, on what basis and for what ends? So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure at the end of the day that we disagree substantially about this, and we may be just a different emphasis for this talk, but just a couple quick thoughts in response. Yes, I think you're correct that there are certain qualifications to Mill's colonialism. But it seems to me that colonialism sits more easily, maybe sits very easily with a doctrine that suggests that people should have liberty only if they can make good use of it. The corollary, I mean, the logical corollary of that is that if they can't make good use of it, they themselves are, as he says, an entire people in their non-age. There's nothing wrong with you as a more civilized nation coming along and taking that liberty away from them. And I think it's significant that a natural rights philosophy, a doctrine that assumes that all human beings, qua human beings, have freedom and have equality and have self-determination, is not, on the surface at least, a doctrine that is amenable to colonialism in the same way that Mill's version of utilitarian liberalism is a kind of apologia for colonialism, really. So I don't think that there's a complete disagreement between us. Point well taken about trade, right? He distinguishes that trade falls into that class of things that society can, in principle, regulate. But the thrust of Chapter 5, as you point out, is that it's only in very extreme circumstances that society should, in fact, regulate it. Right? It can regulate, but probably should not. And then there are passages, I take your point, there are passages in Mill that might seem a bit more respectful of the role of entrepreneurs. I have in mind not the passage that you mentioned, but there's a section in the Principles where he talks about the business of life. And he describes our activities in the marketplace as being something that's potentially educative, that people in the marketplace learn to make decisions, learn to take responsibility, that there's a kind of developmental education that comes about through this business of life. To my mind, though, that's really the closest he comes to really praising a life of trade and attributing that spirit of genius and innovation to entrepreneurs in the market. In the section you mentioned, yeah, there's lots of praise for spontaneity and for eccentrics, but the ones he mentions there, it's Socrates, it's Luther, it's Galileo, right? It's people who are thinkers, right, rather than people who are tradesmen, merchants, entrepreneurs. Yeah, so points well taken. Thanks.
Yeah, so the heroic entrepreneur is very specifically Oprah Winfrey. That's the
Well, thank you all very much for your respective talks this evening. I definitely enjoyed them. One thing that I'm curious to hear each of you elaborate on with respect to the thinkers you discussed is much of the focus of this evening's discussion so far has been on how these thinkers explored the limitations appropriate to state intervention in economic behavior. but of course, the ways in which the state does or does not intervene in economic behavior and economic liberty have a very important, tangible impact on the resulting material conditions that people find themselves in. And the material conditions of people's lives, in turn, shape their political perspectives and political behavior. So I'm curious to hear each of you elaborate a little bit on the extent to which you think these thinkers have something to say about that sort of feedback loop between the level of state intervention or form of state intervention in the economy, the resulting material conditions that the populace faces, and how that in turn shapes their political behavior and its effects, again, on policy.
All right. That's a great question.
It's a question that's very dear to Governor Romney's heart, I believe.
Yeah, that's true. That's a terrific question. So I can only attempt the beginning of an answer, but I'll attempt the beginning of an answer. So let's say that we have a political community in which either as a matter of political and economic prudence or as a matter of natural right, property is respected. What is it then that emerges, and what comes about as a sort of model of human flourishing, if you will? And it seems that there are a few qualities that seems to emphasize. For example, obviously industriousness, that people who work hard, we would expect, would do better. And people who don't work hard are going to receive not punishment from the state, but a sort of natural disability. Along with that, there would come a certain kind of self-reliance. We would expect that in the character of the people who make their own way. To a great degree in Locke's hands, and to some degree maybe in Hobbes as well, there's also a sense that as we turn toward a consideration of matters of property, we will become more tolerant of people with respect to other worldly matters, religion and so on and so forth. So all of those might emerge as characteristics that come about in a people as a result of the political economic policy. And then we can begin to see what effect that begins to have on politics. And in some respects, it's a good effect, I would say. If people become more tolerant of private diversity, I would say that's a good thing, and maybe, I know Rousseau disagrees with me, but maybe even a good thing for private human flourishing. But on the other hand, if we come to emphasize self-reliance as a kind of virtue, then we have a very different attitude toward charity. And if we come to emphasize something like toleration, why? Because we're really interested in doing business with people, not in their private religious beliefs, then in some sense we become more materialistic. I mentioned just in passing during my talk that Locke does this very liberal thing with the idea of the summum bonum, and he says, why are we asking about this? It's going to be different for each person. But in some sense, once you say that, it becomes harder just to take the idea seriously. Philosophers, Locke says, for 2,000 years have debated this, and it's in vain. We don't even debate it anymore. I mean, can we even ask the question, what is human flourishing? So there is a loss for all of those gains. Maybe that begins to answer the question of what the feedback looks like. There are gains as well.
Good question. I'll limit what I would say to Rousseau is, I think, precisely worried about the feedback effects, which is if we're going to somehow transform our self-interest for Rousseau in political realm into a kind of interest in the whole of society as we identify ourselves as citizens, we have to be able to identify with one another, and the degree to which we are significantly different, including in material conditions, we can no longer really identify with one another in a way that's going to make for him work. And Smith shares that concern too, in terms of the rich no longer being able to view the poor as being humans and having the proper attitudes toward them. So Rousseau's not alone in that. And so I think in a lot of ways his regulation of all sorts of features of society, including economic features, is precisely because he's worried that if you start, the rich start identifying themselves as rich, the poor identify themselves as poor, and now we're back in the problem. You know, each of them needs one another. And now are using one another, and they get involved in this game that once again leads to the destruction of human flourishing, the destruction of legitimate societies. So the piece is precisely concerned about that feedback effect.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great observation, right? Policy creates character, it creates constituencies, and then that feeds back into the political process. This isn't even a kind of abstract or theoretical issue for Mill. It's a concrete political issue for him. As you know, in the 19th century, a series of reform bills extending suffrage to ever greater portions of the English population. This was something that Mill was deeply conflicted over, right? On the one hand, committed to the idea that you have to bring the laboring classes into democratic politics. And yet, you have to be careful when you do that, because the laboring classes, without some degree of improvement, without some kind of education, if you just usher them in, it's likely that their lower tastes, lower passions, their ignorance might very well change the very character of politics. So it leads him to strange proposals like proportional voting, where people with college degrees or PhDs get to cast more votes than people who don't have them. He tries to say that it's related to education, but in unfortunate ways for Mill, I think it tracks onto social class. So there's a great worry and misgiving and anxiety about the laboring classes and what's going to happen when they make their way into the center of politics. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think now will be the time to move over to the next room where we can have some wine and cheese and we can continue answering these questions. But I would first like to thank our panelists, and maybe we do a quick round of applause again. Thank you very much.